In the Scrum Guide, you can find the phrase sprint planning is time boxed to a maximum of 8 hours for a 1 month sprint. Let's assume that 1 month is approximately 4 weeks. I know on the average it's a little bit more than 4 weeks, but let's assume a month is the same as 4 weeks to make it easier. So if you're working in 4-week sprints, sprint planning can take up to 8 hours as quoted from the Scrum Guide before. Now the question is, how long can sprint planning take if we are working with 2-week sprints? Well, as we are cutting sprint duration in half, you should suppose that we are also cutting the duration of the sprint planning in half. That would mean that sprint planning can take up to 4 hours for a 2-week sprint. If that sounds logic to you, you should watch this video because it is not correct. Before we actually start, we need to clarify what is a time box. If an event is time boxed, this means that it cannot take longer than the defined time, but you can finish early. Let's use an example. If your time box is 8 hours, you need to finish at the latest after 8 hours, but you can also finish after 6 or 7 hours if you're done earlier. In Scrum, there are 4 events that are time boxed: sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. Some people will also count the sprint itself and the product backlog refinement into the Scrum events. However, that's a topic I will deal with in another video. Well, these 4 events have a time box. The duration of the time box for each event mentioned in the Scrum Guide always refers to a 4-week sprint. The time boxes are as followed. Sprint planning can take up to 8 hours. The daily Scrum always takes 15 minutes. Sprint review can take up to 4 hours, and the sprint retrospective can take up to 3 hours. Many people will tell you that the duration of the Scrum events is proportional to the sprint duration. If the sprint takes 4 weeks and the sprint planning is time boxed to 8 hours, then sprint planning for a 2-week sprint may only take up to 4 hours. On some websites or blogs, you can even find a formula. There are 2 hours of planning for each sprint week. Now you only have to multiply the length of your sprint with these 2 weeks to get the exact time box for planning. For example, if you're working with a 3-week sprint in your project, you simply multiply these 3 weeks with the 2 hours per sprint week and get a maximum duration of 6 hours for the sprint planning. Obviously, you can use these multipliers for all types of Scrum events. Sprint planning is, as mentioned already, 2 hours per sprint week. The sprint review is 1 hour per sprint week, and the sprint retrospective is 45 minutes per sprint week. Only the daily Scrum has always a time box of 15 minutes. Here the sprint length has no impact. All that sounds very reasonable, doesn't it? However, this is not correct. The concept just shown is completely wrong. In the contrary, this is a frequent misconception. However, you can find the Scrum myth published on many websites. Let's have another look on the Scrum Guide. It also tells us something about the length of the events for sprints that are shorter than 4 weeks. For these cases, the Scrum Guide says, for shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. So please note, it does not say for shorter events, it is proportionally shorter. That's a huge difference. Well, I guess we can assume that Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland are smart enough to invent such a formula with the multipliers that I just mentioned before. If they don't use it, there must be a reason why they apply this very generic term: for shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. To explain this, I need to explain 2 concepts from microeconomics that are called economies of scale and cost stickiness. Let's start with the term economies of scale. I would like to explain this concept that you might already know using a very simple example. Let's assume you're producing 1,000 units of a certain product, and you're incurring costs of $1,000 for that production process. That means the unit cost is $1. If you produce 100,000 units of the same product, your cost will not necessarily be $100,000. Maybe it's just $50,000. That means that your unit cost went down from $1 to only 50 cents. This effect is called economy of scale. There are various reasons for the economies of scale. One that is very obvious is the fact that the fixed costs are distributed over a larger number of units. For example, the development of a certain product might cost you X dollars. It does not matter if you're producing later on 1,000, 100,000 or a million units. The development cost will always be X. An area in which you can experience economies of scale in your daily life is printing. Ask in a print shop how much it costs to print 100 copies of a brochure. Then you ask how much it is to print 500, 1,000 or 10,000 copies and calculate the unit costs. You will be surprised. Let's have a look on the opposite case. What happens when production is declining? Let's assume we're producing 100,000 units at a cost of $50,000. In this case, a unit costs us 50 cents. Due to an economic crisis, demand drops, and now we produce and sell only 50,000 units. Your problem now is not only that your production has cut in half. Additionally, your costs won't cut in half. Maybe the production of these 50,000 units will cost you $35,000 instead of $25,000 if costs were proportionally scalable. In other words, your unit cost rose from 50 to 70 cents. You're producing now at a much higher cost. In microeconomics, this phenomenon is called cost stickiness. If you lower your production, costs will not decline proportionally. That is because you're distributing the fixed costs now over a smaller number of units. Why did I explain you these two concepts, the economies of scale and cost stickiness? Well, that's what's also happening with the duration of Scrum events. If you're working in sprints that are shorter than 4 weeks, the duration of the Scrum events will not drop proportionally, but disproportionately lower. Let's have a look on sprint planning. This Scrum event has a duration of 8 hours for a 4-week sprint. If you're working with 2-week sprints, the event obviously can be shorter as you are planning less work in it. But it is very likely that you won't be able to cut duration in half. Why? Well, there are simply activities within the sprint planning meeting that can't be shortened proportionally. The Scrum Master, for example, might welcome everybody, explain the agenda, and put everybody on the same page. The product owner might explain the product vision to the development team and proposes a sprint goal. All these activities not necessarily take less time only because the sprint is shorter. The same thing is true for all other Scrum events. In the sprint review, you might explain to your client the testing procedures that you applied, and this will not necessarily take less time only because the sprint is shorter. Let's have a look on the sprint retrospective. In the sprint retrospective, the team wants to improve the Scrum process and the definition of done. A problem might be that communication between the development team and the product owner is not good. Solving these communication problems does not become easier only because the sprint is shorter. Coming up with a more demanding definition of done won't take less time only because the sprint is shorter. I think now it's easy to understand why the Scrum Guide just states for shorter sprints, the event usually is shorter, but does not mention a formula that is based on a proportional reduction of the duration of the Scrum events. The activities I just mentioned are like the fixed costs in the microeconomic concept of cost stickiness that I just explained. You can reduce production but not all costs will decline proportionally. In Scrum, it's the same. You can reduce the duration of the sprint, but not all activities within the Scrum events will shorten proportionally. If we follow that idea, it means that longer sprints are more efficient than shorter ones because the ratio between the duration of the Scrum events and actual development work is better. At the same time, this means that shorter sprints, for example 1 week sprints, are less efficient. This could be a reason why experienced teams might tend to use longer sprints. However, there are various factors impacting the efficiency of a sprint, which I will explain in a separate video. Summary. It is a myth that the duration of Scrum events drops proportionally with a shortened duration of a sprint, because each event contains activities that do not depend on the sprint length. This is similar to the concept of cost stickiness in microeconomics. Therefore, sprint planning in a project that uses 2-week sprints does not necessarily have to take a maximum of 4 hours. It could be also 4.5 or 5 hours without contradicting the concept of time boxing. This is also true for all other Scrum events. That is why the Scrum Guide states for shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. If this video was helpful for you, please give me a thumb up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.